Donald Trump arrived at a high-profile racing event expecting the imagery of presidential power. And instead, the cameras captured something much harder to control: audible boos, an awkward presidential suite scene, and security personnel telling camera crews to stop filming the president. That does not prove every dramatic interpretation now circulating about what happened inside that suite, but it does create a legitimate political question. Why were cameras being ordered away at precisely the moment the president's public appearance was becoming part of the story? And the answer matters because this administration has spent enormous energy controlling the image Americans see, while much bigger questions about Trump's judgment, his late night messaging, and his handling of mounting economic and foreign policy pressure remain unresolved. Start with what can actually be established from the event itself. During the broadcast, personnel could be heard instructing camera operators to turn their cameras away from the presidential suite. One instruction was explicit: "I need the cameras off the president right now." A second exchange indicated that the network had already been asked to stop showing the presidential suite. Separately, portions of the crowd could be heard booing, and another clip included someone shouting, "Traitor." Those are three separate things, and they should not be collapsed into one giant conclusion. The camera instruction happened, the hostile crowd reaction happened. Neither fact, by itself, establishes why the cameras were ordered away. That distinction is important because there are perfectly ordinary reasons security personnel might restrict filming around the president. The Secret Service deals with protective information, movements, sightlines, and people around the protectee. A presidential suite is not automatically an unrestricted television set, simply because cameras can see inside it. So, the strongest defense of what happened is straightforward. This may have been a routine security or broadcast management instruction that happened to occur during an embarrassing political moment. Fine. Take that explanation seriously. Then ask what evidence would settle it. Was there a general restriction against filming the presidential suite? Were all networks given the same instruction? Was the restriction established before the uncomfortable footage appeared? Was there a security reason communicated to the broadcasters? Without answers to those questions, you cannot responsibly jump from "turn the cameras off" to the White House deliberately covered up embarrassing footage. But you also cannot pretend the timing has no political significance, because the president was already experiencing exactly the kind of unscripted public reaction that political operations hate. Crowds are useful political evidence, precisely because they cannot be edited into a press release. A booing crowd does not establish national public opinion. It is not a scientific poll. It tells you what some people in one particular audience thought at one particular moment. And that is still information. The more revealing part of the appearance may be what happened around Trump himself. Footage described in connection with the event showed people around the president directing his attention toward the racing action, and another sequence involved confusion around handling the green flag. Other footage showed Trump struggling with his jacket. Now be disciplined about this. Video can show behavior. Video cannot diagnose a medical condition. You can look at an awkward interaction and reasonably describe it as awkward. You can compare repeated public appearances and ask whether there appears to be a pattern. What you cannot responsibly do is watch several seconds of footage and announce a neurological diagnosis. That standard should apply to every president, regardless of party. Remember how aggressively Republicans scrutinized Joe Biden's public appearances? A stumble, a pause, a confused expression, or a verbal mistake could dominate political coverage for days. Entire arguments about presidential fitness were constructed around video clips. If that standard was legitimate then, Republicans cannot suddenly declare visual evidence irrelevant when Trump is the person being examined. But Democrats should not adopt the worst version of that same standard either. The proper question is not, can I find a weird frame? It is whether repeated observable behavior, considered alongside substantive decisions and public statements, creates legitimate questions about presidential judgment. And something happened later that makes that question considerably more interesting. Around 12:30 in the morning, Trump amplified an extraordinary promotional message, describing what he called a coming midterm meltdown. The material predicted an exceptionally chaotic and dangerous period in American history, including street violence, prosecutions of powerful people, and a potential constitutional crisis. Then the message pivoted into investment recommendations and an invitation to purchase access to financial material. Think about that sequence. The President of the United States amplifies a message forecasting domestic turmoil and constitutional crisis. And the same message uses those fears to promote investment opportunities. That deserves scrutiny, regardless of who occupies the White House. The most important issue is not that Trump was awake after midnight. Presidents work strange hours. Posting late at night proves essentially nothing about someone's fitness. The content is the issue. When the president amplifies predictions of massive street violence, criminal prosecutions, and constitutional instability, Americans have a right to know whether he's endorsing those predictions, merely sharing somebody else's marketing material, or failing to appreciate the distinction. Those possibilities are politically very different. And notice what just happened to our original question. The racing footage initially looked like a story about embarrassing optics. Once you add Trump's own public communication hours later, the more consequential issue becomes judgment. That is the standard worth applying here. Not whether Trump looked good in a luxury suite, not whether somebody can freeze a frame that makes him appear confused. What does the president himself choose to communicate when nobody is forcing words into his mouth? And when a president's account distributes material invoking constitutional crisis and domestic violence alongside financial promotion, that deserves considerably more attention than whether he buttoned his jacket correctly. There is also a media literacy trap here that people on both sides fall into. A compilation can place booing, an awkward interaction, a camera restriction, and a late night post next to each other. Your brain naturally converts proximity into causation. Suddenly, the cameras were obviously turned off because Trump was being booed, or because somebody inside the suite was angry, even though the available evidence does not independently establish that motive. That missing step is where political misinformation thrives. A reasonable person sees several individually real things, connects them, and accidentally becomes more certain than the evidence permits. That is exactly the discipline I built Don't Get Played Around. Separating what you saw from what somebody wants you to infer from it. It's a $9 one-time digital ebook. The first link is in the description or pinned comment, because the next piece of this story is larger than the racing event. Trump is operating inside a political environment where economic pressure and international instability are increasingly colliding with the administration's domestic message of strength. The material Trump amplified talked about government spending driven by foreign wars, domestic unrest, border security, surveillance, and federal law enforcement. It specifically promoted the potential financial upside of companies benefiting from expanding federal security spending. That creates a strange contradiction. Politically, Americans are being sold strength and control. Financially, the promotional argument depends on instability, threats, and government responses to those threats. Those two messages can coexist. Governments routinely spend more on defense during dangerous periods. But when the president personally amplifies material, effectively telling followers that enormous turmoil may create an investment opportunity, scrutiny is not partisan hysteria. It is basic accountability. And outside the United States, the strategic picture described by officials is becoming more complicated as well. An Iranian-linked official said Iran had received an invitation involving Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey to participate in a joint defense arrangement. That reported invitation should not be treated as equivalent to a completed alliance. An invitation, even if accurately described, is not membership. But the broader implication is worth watching, because American influence in the region depends partly on governments believing Washington remains the indispensable security partner. Former General Barry McCaffrey offered an especially severe assessment, arguing that American forces may have permanently lost access to numerous Persian Gulf bases, and that the United States could be forced to negotiate new arrangements elsewhere. That is his judgment, not an established final outcome. Again, separate prediction from fact. But don't ignore serious warnings simply because they are predictions. Then, look at the economic confrontation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has publicly advocated escalating economic pressure against Iran. Iranian officials, meanwhile, have threatened retaliation against American economic interests, and warned that cooperation by neighboring countries could produce consequences for regional oil exports. That is where geopolitics stops being an abstract argument happening thousands of miles away. Oil moves, shipping costs move, diesel moves, transportation costs move, and eventually prices throughout the American economy can move. Iranian threats are not guarantees that Iran can successfully execute everything it threatens. Washington possesses enormous economic and military capabilities. Tehran has every incentive to exaggerate its leverage. That's the strongest competing interpretation of the larger narrative. Trump may be accepting short-term disruption because he believes sustained American economic and military pressure will eventually produce concessions. That strategy cannot simply be declared a failure before its outcome is known, but it can be tested. What is the objective? What constitutes success? What is the acceptable economic cost? How long does the administration expect Americans to absorb that cost? And what happens if the adversary refuses to capitulate? Those questions matter more than declarations of toughness, because power is measured by outcomes. The same standard applies to Trump's confrontation with Canada. Tariffs can be used strategically. They can protect particular industries or create negotiating leverage. But tariffs are also taxes on imported goods, and businesses frequently pass at least part of those costs through supply chains. Canada matters, especially because the American and Canadian economies are deeply integrated, including in energy. So when Washington escalates a trade confrontation with one of America's largest trading partners, while simultaneously dealing with instability in global energy markets, those policies cannot be evaluated independently. The household paying more does not care which geopolitical theory produced the receipt. And this brings us back to that racing suite, because presidential politics increasingly operates on two levels. There is the image of power, the motorcade, the security detail, the luxury suite, the sporting spectacle, the cameras. Then there is the exercise of power, trade policy, military commitments, economic coercion, federal spending, and the messages a president chooses to send to millions of people. The first can be choreographed. The second eventually produces measurable consequences. That is why ordering cameras away deserves examination, but should not become the entire story. We do not currently have enough evidence to say that those cameras were definitely shut down to conceal Trump's behavior. Anyone presenting that motive as conclusively established is outrunning the evidence. We do have evidence that cameras were instructed to move away from the presidential suite. We do have evidence of hostile reactions from portions of the crowd. We do have footage of awkward moments involving the president, and we have Trump's own late-night amplification of extraordinarily dark predictions about American political instability, combined with financial promotion. Those facts require no medical speculation and no invented conspiracy. They create a simpler political problem. Donald Trump's strongest political brand has always depended on control. Control of the room, control of the negotiation, control of America's enemies, control of the economy, control of the narrative. But control is ultimately tested when something refuses to cooperate. A crowd refuses to cheer. A camera captures an uncomfortable moment. A trading partner refuses the demanded terms. An adversary refuses economic pressure. Prices refuse to follow the political message. Those are not interchangeable events, and combining them does not prove that the administration is collapsing. But they all impose the same test. What happens when presidential claims encounter independent reality? And that is the conclusion the racing footage actually supports. The boos establish opposition inside that crowd, not nationwide rejection. The awkward footage establishes observable behavior, not a medical diagnosis. The camera instructions establish that filming was restricted, not why. The late-night post establishes what Trump chose to amplify publicly, not necessarily that he personally authored every claim inside it. Those distinctions do not protect Trump, they protect your argument, because an evidence-based criticism is much harder to dismiss than an exaggerated one. The next viral political clip will ask you to skip exactly those distinctions. The next poll, accusation, court filing, or official explanation will do the same thing. Don't Get Played is a digital method for becoming harder to manipulate while defending your political convictions with evidence. It's $9, one time, through the first link in the description or pinned comment. Political reaction is immediate. A defensible conclusion has to survive the evidence.